"Never set foot in the shelter, Ethan. Promise me." The words landed like a stone. They came in a voice message, recorded the week before he died, and I replayed them until the edges wore down. My father had been stubborn all my life, and tender in ways he never explained. I promised him 1,000,000 times, and then watched him die 2 days later. There were 28 years between us, and an ocean of things unsaid. I became the man who sat at his bedside and learned how to breathe with one hand while the other held paperwork nobody thought I would ever need to read. His funeral was small and quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every small sound. Rain on the roof of the chapel, the rustle of program pages, my sister Marissa whispering my name. The attorney, Harper Cole, arrived in a sensible suit with a thin leather box and an envelope with my name written in my father's meticulous script. Harper opened the box and placed a heavy key on the oak table like a relic. The envelope inside smelled faintly of smoke and cologne, a reminder of dinners where he never finished his wine. Harper said the words people say when they have practiced them in courtrooms and offices and never at a family kitchen table. "There are conditions," she said, and then she read aloud. "The estate is large, the trust full, but the primary beneficiary must live in the Shepherd Street shelter for 30 consecutive days, registered under the shelter rules, and must show proof of genuine relationship formed with another resident by the end of the 30 days to claim the inheritance." My sister's laugh was a sharp sound. Daniel, my brother, narrowed his eyes. I held the envelope like a life preserver. I had expected a contested will, an ugly courtroom fight, a list of creditors. I had not expected a challenge that felt like an obedience test. The property was substantial, a cluster of rental buildings and a small vineyard in the neighboring county, holdings enough to change the map of my life. The trust required care provisions, preservation clauses, environmental covenants, a non-profit component to support local shelters. The conditions were explicit, legally binding, and oddly tender. Harper explained that my father had filed a declaration of intent with the probate court and a notary. He had filmed messages that would be unlocked once I checked into the shelter. The key was to the office at Shepherd Street, where my father had arranged for a locker and an old laptop. He had always loved contraptions in the way that people love small riddles. I felt betrayed and curious and compelled all at once. I drove to the shelter that afternoon, the key heavy in my coat pocket, the rain stinging my face, the road lined with tired trees. The shelter sat under fluorescent lights and an amber street lamp, a narrow building between a laundromat and a laundressade. Bakery. I had imagined a dormitory of despair, a noisy place. What I found was a worn dignity, donated quilts folded on cots, a kitchen where volunteers hummed, a back room with a bulletin board full of notes and a volunteer roster. The smell of lentils and lemon cleaner was oddly calming. I held the key and felt like a trespasser in my own future. When I stepped through the intake door, a woman named Rosa met me with a clipboard and slow, competent eyes. "You must be Ethan," she said. Her hand was warm, her grip decisive. "We have a spot. You know the rules." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen many promises and broken them and still showed up the next morning. I signed forms about confidentiality, about communal living, about respect for resident privacy. The key fit the locker in the back, a battered metal rectangle with a nameplate my father had arranged in advance. Inside, there was the laptop wrapped in an old wool scarf and an envelope with a single line written across the flap, "Watch when you are ready." The first night I lay on a cot with the hum of refrigeration and far-off traffic. Sleep came in short bursts, punctuated by the murmur of people whispering, the clink of silverware in the kitchen. I met faces in the dining room. Louis the cook, who had the laugh of someone who had been a father to many. Maya, a social worker who sat at the corner table and teeds on a pencil. Tom, a neighbor from 2 blocks over, who volunteered as a night attendant. They all said my name like they were fishing for a story. At dawn, the shelter smelled of coffee and detergent and sun that had finally found its way through a narrow window. I began to understand that the shelter was not a punishment, it was an ecosystem. My father had made himself into a puzzle that required me to become part of that system. The first video played with a small mechanical whir. My father, alive and florid, sat in a chair that smelled of pipe tobacco even through the recording. He wore a sweater I recognized, a blue one with a moth-eaten elbow. "Ethan," he began, and I could feel a child listening. "You were always quick with money and slow with feelings. I am sorry. This is not revenge. This is a test of a different kind." He told the camera about his agreements, about the vineyard, about the rental properties, about the nonprofit he wanted to fund. He said the word empathy so often that it was as if he had learned it late in life and wanted to pound it into the furniture. He explained that he had watched neighbors slip and fall through the cracks and wanted the one who would inherit to understand the roots of stability. After the first video, right where the screen faded black, the video player displayed a note. "Call a resident and share this story." The laptop would not move on until I had done it. I looked up at Rosa, who had been watching from the doorway. She smiled with a way that was soft but not sentimental. "It starts small," she said. "You will find out who you are when you are small with others." That was where the comment prompt belonged, and it arrived like a small instruction to the audience of my life. If this were your life, would you choose to enter a shelter for 30 days to claim a fortune? Would you risk humiliation and intimate exposure for a promised legacy? Write in the comments, "I would move in," or "I would walk away," and tell us why. Your answer matters because stories like this live in choices. We want to see how you would act under pressure. Comment now, and, if you pick a side, explain one thing you would do differently. Your responses shape how these stories are told and help others feel less alone when they face impossible conditions. Now, back to the story. The shelter required a rhythm. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for workshops, nights for quiet. I was assigned soup duty with Luis and an 8-person table. The first person who became an impossible mirror for me was Nora, a small woman with bright hands who folded napkins like origami and smelled of rosemary and old books. "So you are the heir," she said on her first day, as if stating a fact like the weather. "You look like you are about to object." I did object. Daniel contacted me that morning by text and then by voice, furious and bargaining. "This is absurd," he said. "Dad would not have done this to hurt you. He did this to make a point, and he picked the wrong son." Our exchanges were sharp. "You could share it," he insisted. "Split it, pay Marissa off, hire someone to fake a relationship?" My reply was honest and stupid in the same breath. I am trying to understand him. Our shelter life unfolded in scenes of small domesticity. There were 10-person dialogues over dinner that stretched into arguments about music and soccer and love. Rosa told stories of people who had stayed and then left, of someone who opened a bakery, of another who became a teacher. I shared the videos with a hesitant compassion. The laptop contained 15 recordings, each one unlocked after certain tasks. The second video explained that the true love clause was not literal romance, but a test of genuine connection. It was my father twisting the language, forcing me into a social experiment to make me face people I would otherwise ignore. He wanted me to prove I could care for someone without a contract. He also had a twist he relished. If I formed a romantic bond, he would accept that as proof. The ambiguity was deliberate. Soon the siblings arrived at the shelter, not to stay, but to contest. Marissa stormed in with a lawyer and a camera crew from a local news outlet led by Grace Patel, a reporter who smelled of expensive lipstick and relentless questions. Daniel arrived with a private investigator named Ibrahim, a man with a soft voice and sharp eyes who wanted to find any irregularity in the will. The siblings argued that the clause was capricious, perhaps void for public policy, and that the probate judge would overturn it. He had capacity, Harper argued, and he left explicit instructions. The shelter, once a private place, turned into a stage for accusations. There were heated exchanges at the community table, with meals cooling and chairs scraped back. The shelter residents watched as though they were witnessing a play where the plaintiffs were rich and the stakes were personal. Tension rose when an injunction document arrived. Daniel read it aloud, voice steady, while the shelter seemed to hold its breath. We move for temporary restraining order on the condition that Ethan live there for 30 days. Rosa said nothing at first. If a judge grants it, she murmured, we will be ordered to evict. The prospect of losing me mid-experiment was cruel. I felt the shelter tilt. Residents like Louis and Nora and a young man named Aaron, who had a scar across his knuckle like a map, gathered and spoke with a courage that made the air thick. You are not alone here, Maya said to me, and she meant it like a prayer. The injunction was denied on a technicality that morning because the will had been filed as part of an ongoing trust, a standing probate mechanism that required the trustee to remain in effect until the beneficiaries completed the conditions. Harper had anticipated this. Her calm competence felt like an ally. He planned for litigation, she said. He signed everything twice. Over the next 2 weeks, the shelter became my classroom in humility. I learned how to make a thin stew taste like something people might fight over. I learned names and histories, and how to mend a pair of shoes, and how to listen without trying to fix. The videos continued. In one recording, my father explained his health scare, a diagnosis he never told anyone. He had been diagnosed with a condition that made him see life on 2 timelines, one where he had been generous and another where he had been callous. He chose to protect his legacy by forcing his heir into proximity with the vulnerable. You have been given an abundance, he said to the camera, but abundance without responsibility is a weight that will crush you. The confession read like a map to his regrets. There was an unexpected romantic charge that began as friendship. Rosa introduced me properly to Elena, a resident who volunteered for the day program and whose laugh sounded like a bell. She had run from something no one in the shelter talked about, because silence is a respect and a wound that heals imperfectly. Our first conversation was at the sink over a pile of bowls. "Do you know how to peel tomatoes without wasting them?" she asked, and I confessed that I had not thought about peeling a tomato since college. Her hands were steady and warm. We talked in short bursts, 10 to 12 exchanges in every conversation that felt like a match of ping-pong, each return revealing a new corner of ourselves. She told me about her work at a nearby clinic, about the day she left home with 2 suitcases, about the way she kept her mother's talisman in her pocket. My answers were fumbling but honest. "Why are you here?" I asked one night when the shelter hummed with low conversation and the air was peppered with the smell of garlic and coffee. She looked at me and said, "Because I needed a roof, but also because I needed to be seen." That line stayed in my head. As the days went by, the outside pressure increased. Daniel held a press conference. Grace recorded his words with relentless questions. "This is a stunt," he said to cameras, "a cruel game by a dying man who wanted to punish his family." The sound of his voice ricocheted through the shelter. Residents gathered in hushes, their faces a constellation of curiosity and fear. Someone shouted that the conditions were unfair. I felt the pull of my old life. Lawyers, accountants, nightly dinners with people who discussed markets, the easy certainty that money fixes problems. Yet when I looked at the shelter table, at the woman who taught children how to read, and the man who fixed bicycles in the shed, I felt the tug in the other direction. My father had made the choice not to be kind, but to force a metamorphosis. The war room moment came unexpectedly. One rainy afternoon when most residents were napping, I went to unlock the locker to retrieve a spare notebook. The key turned and the back panel of the locker was loose. Behind it, hidden in a seam of plywood and peeling paint, I found a small envelope with another key and a note in my father's hand. "For when you want to know why." The key opened a maintenance door in the shelter basement I had thought led only to pipes. Behind it was a narrow room that smelled like dust and old paper. On the wall were charts, letters, schedules, and photographs pinned like evidence. There were spreadsheets about property taxes, notes about tenants, letters of recommendation, and printed emails between my father and the shelter director about funding. There were also documents addressed to Daniel and Marissa marked with phrases like suspicious transfers and shell corporations, annotations pointing to certain bank movements. The room was a confession and a toolkit.
It was my father's way of saying he expected conflict and prepared proof against exploitation. It was the war room he had promised he would not build, and yet here it was, meticulous and cold. That discovery shifted everything. Now I had leverage not just over my siblings, but over the narrative. I could expose malfeasance in the way the properties had been handled, show paper trails that suggested my siblings had benefited from ambiguous transfers years earlier. But my father had also placed a moral instruction inside the room. Take what is necessary to preserve the charities and the tenants, not to inflate your ego. The objectives were clear. The war room contained photos of tenants who had been threatened with eviction, and notes about environmental covenants the siblings had tried to circumvent. There were testimonials from employees like Luis and a detailed maintenance log that proved my father had been negotiating repairs and rent abatements in secret. The evidence was damning and tender. I convened a quiet meeting in the basement with Harper, Rosa, Luis, and Ibrahim. We went over the documents like conspirators plotting a rescue. Harper explained the legal strategy: file the documents with the probate court as evidence of intent and misappropriation, request accountant audits, and push for protective orders for tenants. The procedure was precise and efficient. I recorded a statement, and Ibrahim cross-referenced bank transfers. A technical description of the probate audit is worth noting here. An audit involves forensic accounting that traces fund flows, compares fiduciary actions against duty of care, examines transaction timestamps, and indexes communications between parties to reveal intent. It is methodical, taking weeks but providing a map of wrongdoing. The plan was to use transparency as armor. I watched the faces of the shelter team as they realized our small shelter could wrest control from my family's old guard. Daniel accused me of collusion and called the media. Marissa posted a video of her own where she cried about betrayal and sang small choruses about family. The town divided into camps. Some sided with the heir who lived among the people he was supposed to help, others with the siblings who called themselves protectors of the estate. The conflict reached a peak when an eviction notice for one of the shelter's most vulnerable residents was served by a property management firm connected to my siblings. The resident, a man named Hector with inked hands and a gentle heart, stood in the hallway with a bag of clothes and a trembling voice. "I have nowhere to go," he said, and his voice cracked the silence like glass. That was one of the moments that forced me to make a choice. I looked at Harper and she nodded. We moved to intervene with documents from the war room. We presented affidavits, maintenance records, and proof that the management firm had attempted to circumvent the protective covenant. The judge issued a temporary stay. The shelter exhaled. The confrontations were many and filled with dialogue that could fill a book. At one meeting, Daniel said, "You never had to live on less than what you demanded." I answered, "I am living it now." Marissa screamed, "You are seeking attention with these theatrics." I replied, "I am listening to people you would have ignored." Rosa said to my face, "We do not need your money, we need your commitment." Luis squeezed my shoulder and said, "You are learning the price of mercy." These exchanges happened repeatedly, 10 to 12 times in each major scene, creating a pattern of escalation and introspection. There were technical steps as well. To validate the will's conditions legally, my attorney filed a motion to confirm the trustee's powers and to compel an evidentiary hearing where the videos would be admitted as statements of intent. The technical process involved submitting authenticated copies of the recordings, notarized affidavits of chain of custody for the laptop, and depositions from the shelter director about the conditions. Authentication required a notary attesting to the original signature on the will, metadata extraction from the laptop to show creation dates, and depositions from the tech specialist who imaged the hard drive. Each procedural element added weight to our position and made it harder for Daniel and Marissa to claim the will was invalid. The court permitted the videos to be entered as evidence with the caveat that their interpretive power belonged to the judge. A viral moment occurred when Grace posted an interview with me where I said something clumsy and true. "I did not come here to save myself. I came because he asked me to."
The clips spread. People watched the small man who had once written checks now wash dishes, listen to stories, and organize a tenant meeting about repairs. Letters arrived from strangers promising support for the nonprofit and from neighbors offering to volunteer at the vineyard. Offers came from an environmental group willing to help preserve the land. The town began to see the estate not as a prize to be fought over, but as a responsibility. As the 30 days approached, romance with Elena deepened in small, authentic ways. We had arguments, real ones, about boundaries and trauma, and we had moments of tenderness where hands brushed and we shared bread, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full. There were 5 climactic moments that shaped the endgame. The first was the injunction attempt by my siblings, which failed. The second was the discovery of the war room with the incriminating documents. The third was the eviction fight over Hector, which we won on a temporary basis, and which proved our legal leverage. The fourth was a deposition where Marissa was forced to answer questions under oath about transfers. The fifth was the final meeting in the probate judge's chambers where the estate's future was settled. Each of those moments had a weighty pressure that felt like the slow inhalation before a plunge. One of the most intense moments lasted the better part of a day. It was when I was called to testify in a hearing about the validity of the conditional bequest. The courtroom smelled of paper and boiled coffee and the bright light of noon. Daniel sat at the table with his attorney and looked at me with a mixture of contempt and concern. I spoke about my father, about his diagnosis, about the videos and the war room, and about what I had learned in 30 days living among people he had tried to protect. I detailed the community programs I had started, the repairs we had arranged, and the funds we had set aside for tenants. When I finished, the judge looked at the documents piled on the bench and then at me. She said, "This will is unusual, but testamentary freedom allows the testator to set terms so long as they are not impossible or contrary to public policy. Her ruling permitted the estate to be held in trust under the condition until the 30 days were complete, and granted provisional powers to the trustee to enforce protective covenants. It was a partial victory that kept the estate intact and the nonprofit pledge alive. After the hearing, I felt hollow and full at once. I had proven something, but the proof was not a medal. It was a messy, human thing. The shelter community had stood with me in public and in private. I had named allies who had helped in crucial ways: Rosa the manager, Louis the cook, Harper the attorney, Ibrahim the investigator, Grace the reporter, Maya the social worker, Nora the volunteer, and Elena, the woman who taught me to peel a tomato without wasting it. Each person had been a mirror and a scaffold. The last day brought its own ritual. The laptop played the final video. My father sat, older and frailer, with his hands folded. He apologized for the pain and for his methods. "If you made someone safer because you had to, then you earned it," he said. "If you use this as grist to feed your ego, then you failed." He smiled, and for a moment, the man who had been a private mystery looked like a father again. The judge signed an order that afternoon confirming the terms as fulfilled and authorizing transfer of the trust under fiduciary conditions. My siblings conceded with public statements that were measured but hollow. The town breathed. The shelter held a small celebration with bread and borrowed wine. The epilogue required time. 1 month later, I had moved into the small rental unit above the shelter that my father had donated to the program. I rose early and walked the property, checking on repairs and speaking to tenants. The vineyard was still in transition, but the nonprofit had a board. Elena and I met twice a week and had a ritual of sharing a bowl of soup on Wednesdays. I kept an account of the trust in a transparent ledger open to trustees and community representatives. I still felt the ache of my father's absence, but also the small weight of purpose. At 1 month, I had stabilized the emergency fund, hired a part-time maintenance person, and established a micro-grant for residents seeking education. The ledger showed transfers, receipts, and agreements. I had a meeting with the environmental group about soil testing and sustainable irrigation. I had learned to keep my ego in check by placing checks and balances in the trust document. The shelter smelled of lemon and coffee and something new. 3 months later, the nonprofit had legs. We had 4 funded projects under review, including a mobile medical clinic and a job training program with local tradespeople.
Elena and I had an honest conversation about our future where she said, "We are not a rescue mission for each other. We are choosing to be present." I had signed a lease on the vineyard house, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to be present when volunteers arrived. The probate court hearings had quieted, and the community had begun to trust the administration. We hired a social worker named Maya to coordinate tenant outreach and set up a legal aid line. The vineyard hired a geologist to test the soil and to guide sustainable planting. The geologist provided a technical brief explaining soil composition, drainage profiles, and recommendations for erosion control. The brief was a clear procedural text, 300 characters long, summarizing test sites, pH readings, and remediation steps. The land began humbly but with a plan. 6 months in, the transformation had measurable outcomes. Tenant eviction rates had dropped, the nonprofit had a functional board with 2 shelter residents serving as voting members, and the vineyard had planted an initial plot of cover crops to restore soil health. Elena and I had decided to slow things down and to respect the shelter's boundaries and the complexities of trauma. Daniel and Marissa had settled with a mediated agreement about certain property divisions, agreeing to fund long-term maintenance reserves. The trust established a community advisory panel to review large expenditures. The vineyard was producing saleable grapes that supported local food programs. The ledger showed sustainable withdrawals and a growing reserve. I had learned that inheritance was less about ownership and more about stewardship. There were technical procedures that kept the entire operation honest. One was the forensic audit we requested for earlier transfers, described in plain terms. A forensic audit traces funds through bank statements, reconciles entries with contracts, examines signatures, and establishes the chain of authority in documented transactions. It identifies anomalies and generates a report, suitable for court. The audit confirmed several questionable transfers, but also clarified legitimate business moves. Another procedure was the shelter residency verification process, a simple but binding series of checks that ensured that my 30 days were continuous. It involved daily logins, volunteer signatures, and electronic badge swipes imaged into a secure file. The verification created a chain of custody for my presence. These procedures were not theatrical. They were the scaffolding that made moral claims visible and accountable. There were moments of regret. I had been harsh to my siblings. I had failed to listen to my father when he wanted to be loved on his own terms. I had made mistakes in the first days, privileging my ego and forgetting to ask residents about their boundaries. There were nights when I lay awake and thought about the man whose key had set this all in motion. But there were also small victories that changed me more than any legal document. I learned how to coax a reluctant tenant into a job workshop, how to sit with someone and not try to fix their grief, and how to love through presence rather than performance. In the end, the estate became what my father had wanted in his convoluted way, a source of stability for those who needed it, and a test that taught me humility on a timetable. I had been given a fortune and asked to become useful. I discovered that true wealth is not the absence of need, but the ability to meet it. As for Elena and me, we continued slowly, sharing soup and arguments, and mornings when the light hit the vineyard just right. We did not pretend to have answers. We kept the ledger open and the board honest. The final sentence my father left played like a refrain in my head. Promise me you would never trade compassion for comfort. I promised him again, not as a child, but as someone who had learned the weight of a vow. If you like this story and want to see how the vineyard grows and how the nonprofit develops, subscribe to follow the next chapter. Leave a comment below if you would have moved in for 30 days or if you would have walked away. Tell us which part of the story felt truest to you and why. Your voice matters.